Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're unpacking a really stunning case of unintended consequences in global trade. It's all focused on the North American food economy.
Right.
This is the story of how an aggressive political threat, basically an attempt by Washington to use food exports as a lever against Canada, didn't just fail.
Oh, it did more than fail.
It completely backfired. It created this profound, unexpected structural shift that left U.S. farmers with billions in lost revenue, while at the same time pushing Canada toward greater economic self-sufficiency.
It's an extraordinary example of leverage just completely blowing up in your face. We've compiled sources that detail Canada's very precise, very aggressive $12 billion trade diversification strategy.
$12 billion.
That's the number.
Yeah.
And so we want to see how Ottawa finally leveraged these massive kind of underutilized agreements like CETA with Europe and the CPTPP across Asia.
And then look at the other side of the coin.
And examine the painful structural consequences for U.S. agriculture, which, essentially watched its second largest export market just decide to move on.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really get into this deep dive, we have to start where the conflict started, which was dairy.
It always seems to come back to dairy, doesn't it?
It does. So the narrative that was being pushed really heavily by the previous U.S. administration was that Canada was, and I'm quoting here, taking advantage of the U.S. with its dairy supply management system.
And the threat was huge.
Immense. We're talking tariffs of up to 250% on Canadian agricultural goods. The goal was to force concessions from Ottawa and, pry open their market.
That 250% figure became this political megaphone. I mean, it sounds like an impending trade war.
Of course.
But the vital context here, the thing that was always left out of that narrative, is why that tariff even exists. That extreme tariff is only triggered if U.S. dairy exports go over pre-agreed quota limits.
This is a penalty.
Exactly. It's a penalty for violating a volume limit. It's not the standard price you pay.
It's a protection mechanism, really.
Right. It's designed to stop a massive oversupply. But the actual data, it shows you just how misleading all the outrage was.
Okay, so what did the numbers say?
Well, sources from the International Dairy Foods Association, and you have to remember, this is the U.S. dairy lobby, so they definitely have skin in the game. Their data showed that at the time the threat was made, the average quota utilization was just 26.72%.
Wait, say that again? 26%.
26.72.
Wow. So U.S. exporters were using less than a third of the quota that was available to them completely tariff-free, and they were still complaining about the cost.
That's it. In practice, almost no one was paying those crazy high tariffs because they weren't even close to hitting the volume limits.
So the anger was directed at rules that were, for the most part, not even being applied.
Exactly. But, whether the threat was based on shaky logic or not, it didn't matter. It exposed a huge vulnerability on the Canadian side.
Which was their heavy reliance on the U.S. market itself.
Absolutely. Before all this, something like 3/4 of Canada's entire food and beverage export market was going to the U.S.
That's not just trade, that's a dependency.
It's a structural dependency.
Yeah.
And it was one that the U.S. political leadership was very clearly trying to exploit. What's fascinating here is that this perceived leverage didn't make Canada capitulate.
It did the opposite.
It forced them to stop waiting and actually address that structural vulnerability right at its root.
And that really is the turning point, isn't it? Because we know Canadian agricultural policymakers had, they talked about diversification for years.
Decades, yeah.
But they always resisted anything that felt like protectionism or, a costly trade pivot. So what was it about these specific threats that suddenly created the political will for concrete, irreversible action?
I think it was the shock. The shock of seeing the reliability of your single largest customer just evaporate overnight.
Trust was gone.
Completely.
Yeah.
And that urgency let them move from these sort of academic discussions to actually executing a detailed transformative roadmap. The plan, which was outlined by Farm Credit Canada, had a very hard target.
Which was the $12 billion.
Redirects roughly $12 billion in food and beverage exports away from the U.S. market. And to do it in just a few years. I mean, you don't aim for that kind of shift without serious commitment.
It wasn't just one strategy. It had multiple layers, right?
It did.
The first one was deceptively simple, but it sounds like it was incredibly impactful, aggressive promotion of interprovincial trade.
Yeah, they essentially said, look, let's stop relying on U.S. imports for goods we can actually source or produce right here at home.
Sort of a buy Canadian on a national scale.
Pretty much. They estimated that just by encouraging Canadian provinces to do more business with each other, sourcing vegetables from a neighboring province instead from California, that alone could reallocate about $2.6 billion in trade flows almost right away.
It's import substitution, but it's framed as domestic cohesion.
A much better sell, politically.
The real game, though, had to be global.
Absolutely.
For decades, Canada had signed all these massive trade deals. I think the number is over 15 agreements with 51 countries. That's, 66% of global GDP?
Is that right? The networks were there.
But the goods were still just flowing south to the U.S.
And that's where the budget and the real ambition went. Actively building the infrastructure and the diplomatic muscle to expand into new, stable markets, Europe, Asia, Latin America.
And that part of the plan was expected to generate how much?
That was the big prize, about $9.4 billion in new revenue. The objective was crystal clear for you, the listener. Replace the risky U.S. market with a whole portfolio of new, reliable partners where Canada wasn't just treated like a dependent neighbor.
And economists at RBC, they backed this up. They projected that if Canada really went for it, its share of global exports could jump by roughly 30% over the next decade.
Which would add something like $44 billion to their total export revenues.
So this wasn't just a reaction, it was a long-term economic upgrade.
It was using a political crisis to accelerate what everyone knew was a necessary but very difficult long-term goal.
So let's look at where they started. Their first big success story seems to be Europe, by leveraging CETA.
The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the EU.
Right.
CETA had been quietly enforced since 2017, but this crisis just created this massive sense of urgency to actually use it.
And under CETA, tariffs were gone on, almost everything?
98% of Canadian goods entering the EU. But, just eliminating tariffs isn't enough. You need the logistics, the regulatory alignment.
The boring stuff that actually makes trade happen.
The really important stuff. So to speed it all up, Canadian trade attachés were assigned specifically to key EU capitals, and Ottawa created these fast-track regulatory approval programs for CETA-eligible agri-food products. It was a level of detail that was, frankly, unprecedented.
And we saw actual results on the ground.
We did. Canadian agri-food businesses got proactive. We saw a report from a Quebec dairy farmer. His sales to Europe went up by 34%.
And it wasn't just dairy.
No. Canadian beef, pork, Atlantic seafood. They all started finding new customers in big economies like Germany, Spain, and Italy. But this trade shift, it also connects to a much larger geopolitical story that gave them a critical tailwind.
You're talking about Ukraine?
Absolutely. Russia's invasion of Ukraine just shattered global assumptions about food security. It massively disrupted supply chains for things like wheat and fertilizer.
And that forced European countries to look for new suppliers.
New, stable, and reliable suppliers.
Yep.
Immediately. And Canada, with its reputation for, institutional stability and actually honoring trade rules, well, it aligned perfectly with that urgent need. They were offering the stability the U.S. was threatening to take away.
So that's CETA finally working as intended, driven by this geopolitical storm. But strategically, if Canada really wanted genuine long-term diversification, something that could actually replace the U.S. market, they couldn't just stop with Europe.
No, they needed a massive future-proof market.
Which brings us to Asia.
Absolutely. Asia is the real prize, and it's primarily because of demographics. Over the next decade, Southeast and South Asia are projected to account for over 31% of total global food consumption.
Driven by a growing middle class.
A huge expanding middle class that could afford higher quality imports. Markets like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, those are the key growth engines for the next generation.
And this is where that other big acronym, the CPTPP, comes into play.
Precisely. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It gave Canada preferential access to Japan, Vietnam, Australia, and a whole bunch of other economies.
That's a market of, 500 million people?
Over 500 million high-value consumers. And Canada's also aggressively negotiating new deals with the ASEAN bloc in India. So the infrastructure was there.
But the political will wasn't.
The will to invest in the logistics and the marketing just wasn't there until the trade threats made the cost of relying on the U.S. overwhelmingly painfully high.
And the effects there were rapid, too, right?
Oh, very rapid. Canadian wheat exports to Indonesia shot up. Peas and lentils found this explosive demand in India. Canola started penetrating Asian markets that had previously been totally dominated by U.S. competitors.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The shift is durable. It's structural. And that's a key takeaway for you, the listener, isn't it?
That's the most important part. These are not temporary deals. They're long-term partnerships, and they're built on Canada's reputation for reliability.
A quality the U.S. could no longer guarantee.
Not credibly, no, not under the continuous threat of tariffs. So Canadian companies started signing multi-year supply contracts. They built new cold chain infrastructure based on these new trade lanes. You don't do that for a temporary fix.
So while Canada was busy building all these new bridges east and west, American farmers were facing a quiet but long-term disaster.
It really was. Canada has historically been the second most important destination for U.S. agricultural exports. We're talking about an average of $28 billion a year.
A huge market.
And that market isn't just coming back. In just the first 7 months after the threats, U.S. agricultural exports to Canada fell by 10%. And that trend, it only accelerated as the diversification strategy really took hold.
And the impact on specific sectors in the U.S. is just staggering.
It is.
American dairy farmers, the very group the threats were supposedly trying to help, they were hit hard when Canadian importers just stopped their U.S. purchases and switched their long-term contracts to stable European suppliers.
And that structural loss, it spread like a virus. U.S. beef producers suddenly found Canadian meat processors were switching to long-term, stable sources from Brazil, from Australia, from Argentina.
And once those new supply chains are built,
It's over. Once that investment is laid, once you've established those new logistics and processing standards, U.S. farms are left with almost no chance of winning those customers back. They're dealing with a permanent change in the global supply map.
We even saw it in lumber, of all things.
We did. The tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, they failed to boost U.S. production enough to meet domestic demand. In fact, they actually made the affordable housing crisis worse.
And the Canadian Lumber Company.
They just pivoted, signed long-term contracts with China, Japan, and South Korea, redirecting huge volumes of lumber that had previously been bound for the U.S.
But there's a deep irony here, too, when it comes to input costs for the farmers themselves.
Oh, the potash story. It's unbelievable.
Explain that.
Canada is the largest foreign supplier of potash, a critical ingredient in fertilizer to the United States. So when the administration threatened a 25% tariff on potash, they were effectively jacking up the input costs for the very same U.S. farmers they claimed to be protecting.
It's a self-inflicted wound.
A deep one. It got so bad that the U.S. Agriculture Secretary at the time reportedly had to personally intervene, begging for a reduction in the proposed tariff right in the middle of planting season, just to stop the immediate self-imposed damage to U.S. farm profits.
So U.S. farmers were facing this perfect storm.
A triple threat, really. Losing the Canadian market, facing higher input costs because of potash, and then suffering from China's retaliatory tariffs on corn and soybeans from the broader trade war.
And we saw reports of incomes just plummeting.
Steep declines. Farmers in key states like Wisconsin, Iowa, they were reporting losses of 40% or more since the trade war really ramped up.
Ultimately, this entire episode, it just boils down to a fundamental miscalculation.
A deep one about the nature of food geopolitics.
What was the central mistake?
Treating food like it's an easy-to-replace manufactured good like steel or automobiles. It isn't. When a country's food security, its ability to reliably source the food it needs, is threatened, autonomy and resilience immediately become more important than marginal price differences.
And Canada recognized that and acted.
Decisively. And that's why this change is permanent. Canadian processing companies that used to import U.S. corn have now shifted to sourcing from Brazil. They've invested millions in new logistics and quality control tailored to those suppliers.
To go back to the U.S. means throwing away that investment.
And critically, it means accepting unnecessary political risk all over again. Why would you do that?
And the global perception has shifted, too.
Hugely. Canada is moving closer to its goal of breaking its dependence on the U.S., while international buyers are, more and more, viewing U.S. agricultural products as politically risky.
So if you're a food buyer in, say, Singapore,
You're not thinking about U.S. politics.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking, which supplier won't be shut off by a political tweet? That loss of trust is the real structural cost. The Made in Canada label suddenly became a competitive advantage because it meant reliability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the U.S. thought it was demonstrating strength by weaponizing food.
But what it was actually doing was providing a masterclass to the entire world on exactly how to adapt without relying on U.S. agriculture.
And once that lesson is learned,
And the new supply chains are in place, the change becomes structural. It becomes permanent. Canada found new, high-growth partners all over the world, and U.S. farmers were left to bear the long-term, painful consequences of a political miscalculation.
so what does this all mean? An attempt to apply maximum political leverage using tariffs only served as a powerful catalyst. It pushed Canada to diversify its economy to achieve greater food self-sufficiency.
And it left U.S. farmers with billions of dollars in lost revenue and silos just waiting for orders that, frankly, will never return from their northern neighbor.
It's a crisis that showed that food is power, absolutely.
But it's a type of leverage that shifts decisively when security and stability are prioritized over simple pricing.
And here's a final thought to consider: the global ripple effect. If other allies and trading partners saw Washington weaponize trade so readily against a close partner like Canada,
How many more countries are now quietly beginning their own deep dives into strengthening domestic production and diversifying away from U.S. dependency?